Well, hello, and welcome to Caching in the Northwest. It's kind of an NPR type intro. Let me speed it up a little bit. Hey, this is the podcast from the birthplace of geocaching right here in the great Pacific Northwest. Now, it's Thursday at 9 p.m. Pacific, and they call me Chris of the Northwest. And we're going to talk about geocaches and geocachers from here and all around the globe. So while you're recovering from binge watching that new series all weekend, we'll be caching in the Northwest.
You said you wouldn't tell.
Oh, I didn't tell it was you or what that series was.
Oh, okay, then we're good. Nobody knows.
Yeah, no,
Tonight
just the two people watching.
Yeah. Tonight, though, we're talking about 3D printing with Bpendragon, or Bpendragon if you prefer. So, welcome.
Thank you.
Live audience, you know what to do. Jump in the chat. Tell us what you think about 3D printing and all those other sorts of geocaching stuffs tonight. And, chat amongst yourself if you like. Before we jump into that, though, it's time to bring in our layered lemur. Some say he ponders things he cannot fathom. And others say, after staring at the eclipse without the special glasses, he looks like Leonardo DiCaprio. All we know is he's called Land Monkey.
Good evening.
Good evening.
How do you do?
Do all right.
Okie dokie.
How do you do?
Don't know.
I do that voodoo. You do.
So well.
All right. Well, before we jump into the fun topic of 3D printing, looking forward to learning some more tonight about that topic. But let's also learn a little bit about how everybody can show a little appreciation and support for this podcast like our patrons do. They help keep this podcast coming each and every week. A special thanks out to our corporate Denali level sponsors. That would be Land Sharks. It's been great seeing so many out-of-town visitors coming to visit their award-winning geocache and to visit the wonderful people in their store. If you are looking to visit the Sharks store in Esquimalt, just outside of Victoria, please keep in mind the store is open Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., whereas the geocache, well, gosh, that's open 24/7.
And we suggest 2 a.m.
We do.
Mm-hmm.
Why not?
Along with a little letter to explain to the Esquimalt police what you're doing. Check it all out at landsharkz.ca. And our other corporate level sponsor, well, that's Gold Country Geotourism. Visit exploregoldcountry.com, learn about the geotours, learn about the region. Don't forget to download the app. Find it at exploregoldcountry.com. And folks, if you want to know more about supporting this here podcast, well, click that Patreon link right over there on the cachingnw.com website.
Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Bpendragon, some people have asked, what is a glow?
What is a glow?
Well, I thank you so much.
Yeah.
This works out so well.
He's given up on us.
Exactly. I'm happy to have guests that come on and we'll play into my little bit here. It's all I got. Apparently that's gross liftoff weight.
Okay, question answered. Moving on.
Okay, moving on. Well, it's time for the glow. That is the geocaching log of the week. So whether you read it or whether you wrote it, we want to hear about it because great logs simply make geocaching better. You can send an email or a recording to feedback@cachingnw.com. Did you know you could do a recording on your fancy phone and email those off? Yeah,
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Not a clue in the world.
No, most people don't. But, that fancy phone can also call other numbers. You could call into 253-693-TFTC and show us just how you glow. And, folks, we do need your glows.
Send them in. Do those field recordings. Otherwise, you're stuck listening to me. This week's glow is, it's GC code GC Alpha Kilo 1 November Golf, which looks a lot like the word aching. GC aching. Or is it G caking?
I see.
Yeah. So, but no, that's not an I, that's a 1. GCAK1NG. Cache name is Arbor Day, and the finder was Limax. And let's see, the log says, solved this one with the group, but was unable to make it over to it with everyone else. I'm glad I didn't, because I got to appreciate just how difficult this one is to find on your own. This was my third trek out to the site. I'd made 2 previous treks at night and twilight and could not spot it. This time it still took me close to 15 minutes before I actually spotted it. Once I did, maneuvering my tool of the trade was tricky and trying to retrieve it. Let's just say I'm glad the container wasn't breakable.
Ooh.
After signing the log, it still took several attempts to put it back. It's worth every star of the difficulty. So there you go.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Have you found something and not been able to put it back?
I don't know.
I found a couple that people have not been able to put back previously, but
I remember a finder years ago talking about a specific Altoids tin on a bridge that somehow plummeted into the river while he was trying to retrieve said item. He says, I ran and bought another tin of mints and stuck it under the bridge. So,
The benefit of having a readily available cache container. And one that smells delicious.
yeah.
But tonight we're talking about another type of readily available cache container. Well, maybe readily available. We know we're going to talk more about it. We're talking about 3D printing geocache containers. First, before we get into that, let's find out a little bit about our guest. You may recognize the name, and maybe not everyone has had the pleasure of meeting you. So can you give our listeners a short, uplifting elevator speech about you and maybe how you got started geocaching, the story, if any, behind your geocaching name, and what your favorite geocache type is? Now, I know that's a lot of questions. We can break them down.
So I'm Bpendragon. I've been geocaching since I believe it was 2004. Started out going with my dad, IHAM, caching out there. So kind of been doing this now, I guess, 20 years almost. I believe it was April 2000. It was relatively early 2004, so it's been almost exactly 20 years at this point. My username is just what I am everywhere. It ultimately comes from a book series I enjoyed growing up. And then kind of, I do a lot of making, lot of that's why I'm here. I'm talking about 3D printing. I did the heat press for this shirt that I'm wearing. So just kind of I like to do things with my hands.
Nice.
Yeah.
And what's your favorite type of geocache?
Oh, that's a good question. I really like a well thought out field puzzle. So go to a place and then you can see the cache, but you can't sign it because you need to figure out how to get into it.
Mm-hmm.
There was one we went down to we were down in Phoenix for Christmas, and then out at one of the state parks, I believe it is. There's one where you basically build a little air pressure rocket ship, and the bison tube just doink, like a good 3 feet in the air. It was a lot of fun.
Cool. Says, looks like someone's a fan of Uru Camp.
That is correct. That is Rin, Shima, one of the main characters of the show in the gift there.
Excellent.
Season 3 airing now.
All right. Well, besides the anime and geocaching, it seems you've also gotten involved in 3D printing. And actually, maybe I should just, before I go any further, is it Mr. Pendragon or B? How would you prefer to be?
Bpen is fine.
Bpen. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And apparently my Octoprint server has gone out. There's supposed to be that black square is supposed to actually show a printer in action, but the capture is not functioning, so we'll just turn it off.
Oh dear. All right. Well, as we were discussing, you've gotten involved in the 3D printing hobby. we're curious if you can maybe tell us a little bit about how you got interested in that and how it combines with the hobby of geocaching.
So like I said, I've been geocaching since 2004. So I've been geocaching for a while, and then I believe it was 2014, right about Thanksgiving, is when I got my first 3D printer. One of my buddies in college had one. I was like, oh, that's really cool, because at that point the price had come down from $2,500 for the cheapest one down to about $750 for one that was considered decent. It's actually sitting on the desk next to me here. And so I got started there, and so I've been doing 3D printing for about 10 years now. I've always kind of thought about doing 3D printed geocache related things, either SIG items or caches or things, but it wasn't until about the last about 6 to 8 months that I really started actually doing anything with combining the two. I started recently getting more into cosplay as well, and kind of the design process for 3D printing cosplay props and 3D printing geocaches is related enough that I was able to take the skills and transfer them over.
Cool. So you've merged a couple of hobbies there together.
Yeah.
And printing some creative containers that maybe would be hard to construct otherwise. How do you get the ideas for these containers?
So it kind of depends. Currently, Monkey Cakes and I are doing a series of storybook themed ones, based on children's books or kind of fairy tale fantasy things. Rainbow fish. You can take a 3D printed fish model, and you can use special filaments that changes the color depending on how you look at it. We've got a brown bear. What do? It's a bear sitting on a stump, ready to go. Those aren't out and hidden yet, but we have them ready to go. They're printed. Or a sword in the stone, which is my favorite one. And it's actually out and ready to be found. I'll talk about it a little bit later, I think.
Nice. Now, what actually brought this conversation up is we went out to lunch and you showed me this storybook 3D print that you did.
Yes.
It was working hinge on the book. So you open up the book cover, and of course inside is storage.
Yeah, it was. I think we were theming that one off of Where the Sidewalk Ends by Shel Silverstein, because I used a gray filament for the book, just like the book cover, and we're trying to find a spot where it's the end of a sidewalk and a good place to hide a cache. Unfortunately, like the 2 or 3 places we've found that the sidewalk ends, there's a cache within a 1/10 of a mile, and it's just like, oh, I can't use that spot.
Oh, that's a bummer.
Archive party.
Yeah.
No. What? No, I didn't say anything.
Yeah, funny how those geocaches just go missing. No,
yeah, I don't know.
So like the 3D fish, the bear, the book, where do you get these cool models, and how do you edit or convert them into geocache containers?
So most of my models come from printables.com, which is a website set up by Prusa, who are known for the Prusa printers. My main printer is a Prusa Mark IV, but it's usable by anybody. The idea is it's to share files of your 3D models. There are other sites out there. Thangs and Colts 3D both exist. I've used both of them. But usually I find stuff there because it's usually licensed very permissively for use. If non-commercial is usually perfectly fine. I'm not making money off of geocaches, so I consider it a non-commercial. Mm-hmm. Most of them allow remixes, so you can make edits and changes for personal use or to re-upload if you want to. And so then when it comes to editing it, I usually use so in 3D printing, you have a software called a slicer that you need to use, which takes the 3D model and it generates the code, the path for your printer to use. It slices it into thin layers, and then how to lay the filament down on each layer. And so Prusa Slicer, which is a fork of the extremely venerable Slicer, spelled SLIC3R, has lots of built-in operations. So I can generate a cylinder there and then use that as a subtractive thing. So I can pop a bison tube sized hole into any 3D model and then print it out, pop a bison tube in there. We're good to go. We got ourselves a themed geocache almost for free.
Okay.
You can do more complex operations, like the sword and the stone one is actually so it's two models. There's a stone model that somebody put up, and then the hilt of the sword is somebody put this thing up to use on a Sharpie. Actually, so it's the right size for a Sharpie. You stick it on the end and it makes your Sharpie look like a little sword. So I just resized that slightly. I resized the bore slightly so it would fit around a bison tube. And then I used that. I printed those out, and then I also used the hilt itself to subtract out of the stone a little bit, so it sits down nice and snug and actually kind of almost clicks into place a little. And then the bison tube sits in the bison tube sits in there and acts as the sword, as Excalibur itself. So you pull the hilt and you get Excalibur, the bison tube. And as Iham has said, it's Golf Charlie Alpha Golf Tango Kilo 3 is that cache.
Very cool.
Nice. CRS 98 asked I think what we just went through. Do you do your own CAD 3D? 3D CAD or find them on the internet? So a little bit of both. Mostly if it's a relatively common thing, like looking for a fish model, looking for a bear model, looking for a stone, there are like 1,000 different aquarium stone models available on printables. I don't need to model my own there. But if I need something a little bit more specific, like I'm looking for like a specific roundel or shield or some symbol or whatnot, I might need to create that myself in Fusion 360 or something like that. So it's a little bit of both. Mostly more personal stuff is what I end up doing 3D CAD, because I need to personalize it for my specific need. But for a lot of the geocache stuff, I can find pre-made models that are close enough that you can then edit around.
Very cool. It sounds like you've had quite a bit of experience and made a few models. How many 3D printed containers have you made? And follow up to that is, how are they holding up in the Pacific Northwest?
So are we talking finished or total attempts?
Finished.
Because
finished.
Okay, because most of the time it takes 2 or 3 iterations to get a cache right. Especially the way I'm doing it, scale is really hard to tell through a computer screen. Yeah, you have the 3D view there in the slicer, and yes, I know that it's 250 millimeters wide on the print bed, but that's still a judgment call. So sometimes you need to print it a couple times. As it is, only Camelot is actually out at the moment. The others we've got printed and ready to go. But it's holding up fine, and I feel it'll hold up just fine for multiple years, just because I printed it out of PLA, which is the most common printing filament. And PLA is biodegradable, yes, and compostable, but it really only actually breaks down when you get like much higher temperatures in very specific conditions. I believe it was CNC Kitchen on YouTube, who's a great 3D printing YouTuber, took a series of prints, all printed the exact same time, the exact same filament, and put them in a series of different tests, including buried slightly like 3 inches into the ground in his backyard. A year later, literally no change. And he's in the Netherlands. Weather's similar enough. It's not going to be really an issue around here.
All right. Yeah. Well, CRS90 asked which resins work well for field placement, which I think you covered.
So resins. Well, there's actually a little. We're going to make a little change there. Filaments. Because in 3D printing, and this is actually skipping forward a couple of questions, but we can do that. So 3D printing usually is done using filament, 1.75 millimeter wide piece of plastic that's just fed continually through your extruder and placed down hot, and it fuses with the previous layers. PLA and PETG are the most common ones, and that's what I print in 90% of the time. PLA is very easy to print. It is easily, by far, the most common 3D printing material in the world. Tons of colors available, tons of slightly different variations. Base PLA has a little bit of an issue with impact resistance, but you can get some PLA Plus that has a little bit of polyurethane mixed in that makes it better. PETG is a little bit more tricky to print than PLA, but not by much. And it has better impact resistance. It also has much better like translucent colors because unchanged PETG is perfectly clear. But so you can add just small amounts of dye and get some really cool crystal looking prints that way. There are more technical filaments like nylon and polycarbonate. I don't recommend them for geocaches because they are an absolute pain to print. ABS is kind of up there as well. ABS used to be the most common back in 2013 to 2017 or so, and then people realized, wait, this is an absolute dog to print, and so moved over to PLA and PETG as the most common ones. You can also do resin prints using an SLA printer, which is a completely different process where you have a vat of UV reactive resin and basically a LCD screen on the bottom. It flashes it, fuses it, and then the build plate lifts up slightly, puts down, flash, and then it goes up and down, and then it slowly raises out of the vat. I wouldn't recommend printing resin prints for geocaches because they're a lot harder. It's a lot harder to print, a lot messier cleanup. I have a resin printer. I barely use it. The build volume you have is always a lot smaller. My Prusa Mark IV can do basically a 6.5 inch cube, more or less, a little bit bigger even. I guess 250 millimeters, so that's like actually 10 inches. 25 centimeters by 25 centimeters by 210 millimeters. But my SLA printer can do 3 inches by 5 inches by 7 or something like that. So it's available to do small, tall, skinny things. So it doesn't work nearly as well for something like that, just volume wise available.
Oh, okay. Am I right in thinking that PLA is basically the plastic that's used in Lego?
No, that would be ABS.
Oh, that's ABS. Okay. And
that's
then
ABS.
PETG is
PETG,
like 2 liter bottles.
No, that's usually high density polyethylene.
Oh, well, see, no, I don't know that.
HDPE,
yeah. So PET, so there's PET, so PET, and then there's PETG, which is PET glycolated. And I don't both have common uses, but I can't remember what they are off the top of my head. PLA is what you'll find when you find compostable plasticware and cups at the restaurants or whatnot. If the fork is marked as compostable, it's probably made out of PLA, polylactic acid, usually derived from corn.
Okay.
Let's see, just finding our way has been using PETG in Arizona.
Yeah,
holding up well so far there.
Yeah, PLA and PETG has a better temperature resistance than PLA. PLA in Arizona would probably melt in the middle of summer, especially if it's down in a ravine between a couple of rocks.
Yeah, they have a bit of more temperature down there.
They do. I also see the question there about, have you tried ASA? Yes, and it's a slightly easier version of ABS to print. It also puts off a lot less toxic fumes when you're printing it. That was another reason we moved away from ABS, was the molten plastic fumes. You required the paradox of, you want an enclosure so that you don't have any drafts, but you need lots of ventilation so you don't choke yourself.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong, right?
Yeah.
Let's see. Skyhawker says, in the Puget Sound area, second one of 3 has put out 44 Star Wars series and 33 World Icon series of caches using 3D printed containers.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
found a few of both of those, and yeah, usually they're printed pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
I find very
Mm-hmm.
nice.
He goes on to say, good news, bad news. They make really neat containers and get lots of favorites. Bad news is they get muggled more often.
Yes, that's one of the problems. That's also one of the problems that we're kind of running into trying to find a good place to hide it, our
Mm-hmm.
caches. Like we hid Camelot in a place where there's cars going by, but there's not a lot of foot traffic, so
Mm-hmm.
you're less likely to have somebody come across it. I've seen a couple of the world icon series ones, and I've kind of been surprised that it's been there because they're in the middle of parking lots for busy shopping centers. I'd be
Sure.
kind of surprised they haven't walked away.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you found some cool, interesting shapes. You've negatively pulled out space for bison. You got out this really cool thing, but do you find that anything that you print with moving parts or the anything with intricate details, does it hold up well? Because let's be honest, not every geocacher is the most delicate and uses the most finesse when trying to open a container in the field.
I kind of avoid that by keeping it simple. I try to avoid having too many moving parts. The 3D printed book, which actually has a 3D printed hinge, which is what's really cool. I wish I had remembered to grab it out of the other room to show. Is like the most complex one in that regard. So keep it simple. Try to, if you're gonna have a hinge, have a simple hinge. If you're gonna have details, be aware that they are going to rub away eventually. But the beauty of PLA and PETG is that they're both relatively robust. And if something goes wrong, it's just a couple hours. You could throw a new one on the bed, print it out, and go replace the container. PLA is cheap. It's less than $20 a kilogram, and a kilogram lasts for a long time if you're doing small prints.
Mm-hmm. It's like jam; it lasts forever.
Not
Not quite,
for
almost.
ages.
Okay. We did talk a little bit. Well, we've actually talked a lot about filaments so far, and the different types you can use in a 3D printer. Have we already gone over what the different types are and what the pros and cons are?
I'd say that we've covered that. PLA and PETG are going to be your most common, your best bets for like low wear. If you really need something that's got a little bit of more wear resistance, maybe try ASA, but it has some of the same flaws of ABS, of warping and issues with beds, and you definitely need a heated bed. And if you really need an engineering filament like polycarbonate and nylon, I would recommend trying to see if you can do it in a different way. Like I've got a nozzle that's coated in polycarbonate from a failed print that I need to basically take a little blowtorch to and carefully melt it out, just because it's just so destroyed at the moment. But yeah, I'd say we'd probably cover that.
Then, like he read my mind, I like a heated bed in the winter as well.
It's not what that means. It is. It's just, a 10-inch square heated bed.
It's kind of small for you.
Small.
Wow.
Yeah. That was why I like to walk.
The cat likes to sit on top of the enclosure when I'm printing because the heated bed warms up the air in the enclosure, which then heats up the enclosure exterior. It becomes a warm bed for the cat.
There you go. And cats like boxes, so.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I keep him out of the box. That's why the box is there.
He thinks outside the box.
Yes.
He tries to think inside the box.
So we talked earlier about how these may or may not, but hopefully will hold up to the Pacific Northwest environment. But 3D printing, as we understand it, is not inherently a waterproof substance, a technology that the end product that the technology creates. But are there things you can do to maintain the quality of the log sheet within?
Yeah. So I like to keep it simple again. I tend to design around the inherent waterproofness of a bison or the near waterproofness of a film canister. by just slotting one of those in there, you get the cool design, but you get the utility of the very strong threads, the very good O-ring, whereas 3D printed threads are usually pretty sloppy. You can sometimes slip an O-ring on the bottom of the one thread, but it doesn't always, but you usually have to crank it down real hard. And if you crank it down real hard, you risk breaking things. So I tend to avoid the problem by just using a pre-made solution that already exists.
Makes sense.
There you go. IHAM said someone had put the bison tube back into the Camelot backwards.
Yes, needed to play a little bit of fishing with that. The one problem I have run into that's a little bit is usually I try and super glue the bison into the cavity I've created, but super glue is not great under the sheer force of opening or closing the tube. So sometimes sometimes just the glue connection will pop or whatever. So it's one of those things you kind of have to figure out what you're doing. The other thing you can do is you can create a little loop somewhere in the model that you can loop some fishing line through and then loop it around the cap of the bison tube so they don't get too separated, even if it doesn't stay in there.
There you go. Again, Skyhawker says 3D printed codec puzzles seem to work well.
Yeah, I found a couple of those. Those are often a lot of fun. There's several different 3D printed tube mazes and codices available. And with those, I find that they actually manage to stay mostly waterproof just because the water has to go all the way through to get all the way back, and there's usually a baggie inside to help with that. But yeah, those are a lot of fun. Those type of things are just a lot of fun to print because you're printing and you're watching your printer go as it builds this up slowly, and you're just like, oh, that's really cool. And then you put it together, and then you got to do the thing to take it apart. So that's a lot of fun.
So the 3D codex, if people don't know, it's usually a tube-like structure with letters and numbers on a series of rings that you have to twist and put in the right order. Lock. Yeah, it's a combination lock before you can slide out the tube inside.
Yeah.
Now, on that note, and talking about the 3D, the codex or the mazes, you mentioned Bpen, the mazes as well. In my experience with those, the dependency on that working is the nub or pin.
It has not broken off
in the cap, and it tends to break off easily if it's printed. What would you suggest is the best solution with that?
Steel.
There's that. I was actually going to say what you can do is, so it depends. It kind of depends on how the model is built. But what you can sometimes do is create a cavity, and then you can actually tell your printer to pause part way and slip something in there and use that. So I've got a project. I'm building a 3D printed telescope, and one of the things you need to put some nuts in. So you tell it to print, and then right before it would cap over the nuts, you tell it to pause. You drop them in, and then the next layer covers over them, so they're captive in there, ready to go. You could probably do the same thing using like a very short screw or a ball bearing. In place of the nub, you take the nub out and you put a little spot for a 3mm ball bearing or whatnot. Print, it goes in, and then there's your hard thing that's not likely to snap off if somebody like jerks on it, because that's usually the downfall of anything 3D printed is a sharp jerk in the direction that the print layers are in. So that's like when you'll cause your print layers to delaminate. The other thing that you can do to help with that is choose an appropriate printing orientation. So you don't want your nub to be made like a cylinder, like you kind of want it to kind of poke out, and then so it's, I'm not explaining this well, but basically, so instead of being like a tree rings going up it, it's kind of got long filaments along it, kind of like a board, so it's less likely to snap.
There's more strength in that longitudinal printing than there is in the vertical.
Yeah, there, because the weakest point of a 3D print is the layer lines, because you're melting,
Sure.
you put down a layer, and then that's had plenty of time to cool before the next one comes along. So yes, it fuses, but it doesn't fuse as well as if it was completely molten still.
Got it.
So it's
Right.
kind of like building something out of wood, and you have to decide which way the wood grain is going to run.
The wood
Mhm.
grain is going to run.
Exactly.
And choosing the best orientation
Yeah.
for your layer
Okay.
lines is choosing
Yeah.
the best orientation for your wood grain.
Now, Skyhawker and I had the exact same idea. He just got to write it down. Use a shelf pin, right?
That's
so
a
the
good one.
pins you those little metal pins you have in to hold your shelves in the adjustable cabinets. One of
Yeah.
those would work really well.
One of those would work really well. And what you can do to make that work is you just take a little cylinder and you subtract it out, so it creates a void there, and just a drop of cyanoacrylate super glue, plug it in there, and good to go.
Okay. Here we'll ask one more. Komakino says, "Do you use Blender for 3D modeling? If so, he might have a project for you."
I tend to not use Blender. My brain doesn't work that way.
My brain is
So
Blender.
Yeah. So I usually, if I'm designing something, I'm usually doing it parametrically. So I'm using something like Fusion 360 or Onshape or some other parametric CAD. So like I can design out a sketch with very specific dimensions, then I can revolve things and add and subtract and whatnot. Versus Blender is generally a lot more organic. Because it's usually more used for things like movies or video game modeling or things like that. So they're both valid 3D modeling techniques, and both work really well. But I just have never really gelled with the way Blender does things.
Okay. That makes sense actually to me. Now, it looks like our listeners are figuring out where we're going next, and they're asking appropriate questions. So, GL&A Geocats, J and LA Geocats. Wow, that I don't know why that was tough. 3 letters. How hard can it be? Said someone actually offered out of the blue to 3D print a set of antlers to replace one that had been muggled from our Huntin' for Cash series. Can't wait to see the end results. That's
I
really
wonder what
nice.
scale those antlers are at.
Yeah.
1-to-1.
Yeah.
Well, fortunately, most slicers these days also have tools for splitting up large models. Like you can create, Prusa Slicer has a built-in cut thing where you can even cut it in a dovetail so it'll slide back together, or you can cut and create little locating pins so it'll line back up perfectly, and you can just glue it together or whatever.
Very cool.
So splitting large models it used to be an absolute pain, but now not so much. I remember the before times.
Okay, Komakino says, I bought a whole bunch of cool 3D printed dragons when I was at SakuraCon.
SakuraCon, yeah.
These
I was just
dragons
there.
are bendable and all printed in one run, not assembled. They are amazing.
Yes, they're what are known as a class of prints called flexies, where the thing I'm printing in the other room that I was hoping to have in the bottom of my screen here is actually a flexi whale shark, where it starts out as like 5 or 6 spots on the bed. They all print up, and then one will loop out, and then the other one will loop through the loop. And so when it comes together, it's a 3D printed chain that's also the shape of, in my case, a whale shark, or the ones Komakino saw were dragons. I've seen T-Rexes. I've seen whales, not just whale sharks, but whales. I've seen sloths, a whole slew of different flexibles.
Yeah, I've seen those that, printed. You may have to break out a couple of support members, but
and usually you don't actually.
Okay.
Because they're designed to print as flat as possible on the bottom, and then the overhangs are shallow enough that it's able to print the little bit into the air that it needs to get around the bend.
Okay. So this brings up the question. I don't know about you, but not everybody has a 3D printer, right? Now, it sounds like you have a couple. which
I've got one that's in constant use, one that's sitting here as a museum piece, one that I'm looking to sell, and then the resin printer that I don't use all that often.
there you go. So you've got 4.
Yeah.
So you probably are not looking to shop out any of the models that you would make, but do you know of any businesses or services that would print a custom geocache for some of our listeners?
Yeah, so there's a couple that I can think of. Shapeways and PCBWay both come to mind. They're both services I've used for their other services. Shapeways can do some really cool stuff, like they can do 3D printed sandstone, sintered sandstone.
Wow.
It's not an FDM process, but it comes out really cool because they can actually paint the sandstone basically in situ, and it comes out as a 3D color print, which is really cool. But I've heard their FDM, their fused deposition modeling, which is what 99% of 3D printers are, I'd say. I've heard their FDM systems are pretty good. PCBWay, I've used them for their one-off CNC milling before, but I've heard their 3D printing is decent. Usually they're a little bit more aimed at engineering samples, and you also have to wait for and pay for shipping from China because they're based in the Shenzhen area. So that's a little bit of a downside on them. But then the other thing you want to look at is local maker spaces and whatnot. Like King County Library has 2 maker spaces at their Federway and Bellevue regional libraries, both of which have 3D printers that you can rent out as long as your print is less than 2 hours long. So you can use your library card to basically borrow a 3D printer for a couple of hours. I believe UW Tacoma has one for their students in their library to use.
They do. Once a month you can use it.
Okay.
You can get a print. My son went there, so that was one of the interesting things.
Most any place that calls itself a makerspace will have at least one i3 clone, if not more, or possibly some bamboo or whatever. So you might want to look into those, because usually it's a relatively small fee per month or annually. And you can then rent time, and then you can reserve time on the printer for your projects there. There's also services like printathing.com allows individuals like myself to say, hey, I have this style of printer, and I am comfortable printing in these filaments, and I have these colors available. And so it's a kind of a service to say for somebody to basically act as a middleman service for, instead of just calling out on Facebook or whatever, I need somebody to 3D print something. It's kind of a little bit more directed than that. I've not used that one directly, so I can't say if it's good or bad or not, but I've heard that it's decent enough, and it's been around for about a decade now. So I'd say that they're doing something right.
Sounds like the Uber of 3D printing.
It kind of, you pay for the print time, you pay for the shipping, and then at some point it ends up at your door
through Uber, through actual Uber, right?
Yeah, via Uber. So we were talking about, if you don't have a 3D printer, but where you can maybe go to use one. What if someone's seriously thinking about, hey, I want to get into this, I want to buy a 3D printer? What, like, we've talked about you've mentioned a whole lot of model names and vendor names, but is there like a good recommendation you would give people as a starting 3D printer?
I would say do not get the $100 Ender or Ender clone that you see. That is a great way to end up in a lot of pain because fighting one of the worst problems that any 3D printer has to fight is first layer, because you need to make sure that your first layer is sticking to the print bed, sticking well, but it's not too squished in, but it's not too far off the bed, and no piece of anything is perfectly flat. So you have to deal with a little bit of possible warp in the bed. So the problem with a lot of the really cheap the really cheap ones is that you end up with bed leveling that is either really manual or non-existent, and then you're in for a bad time with just getting started, and it's really discouraging. Most anything above about $200, $300 now will have at the very least a magnetic bed probe, or where the print bed is usually a piece of metal or a piece of plastic coated metal, and it's a little metal detector that sits next to the nozzle, so it can come down and detect where the bed is, go along, and then it'll actually read like 9 points on the bed to get a map of the kind of the twist of it. You want something that has some level of automatic bed leveling in it, which usually will start at about $200. If you're wanting something that's kind of considered prosumer, like these are both consumer level but also are used in the industry, anything by Prusa is generally pretty good. I have a Prusa Mark IV myself as my main printer. I've previously owned, I guess I still own a Prusa Mark III. That the Mark IV replaced. I've known lots of people with them that work. If you want to go a little bit fancier or whatnot, you can do like Bamboo Labs has their A1 Mini, which has a smaller print area but is a good starting printer. Then they've got their X1C and their Carbon and whatnot, which are massive, fast things. There's a lot of options available, and what's good kind of almost changes like every 6 months or whatnot. Like Bamboo and Prusa are almost always like considered good, but you're going to be paying for it. Like a Prusa Mark IV is $750 for the kit that you have to build yourself, which is a lot of fun to do. But if you're just getting into it, that's another 8 hours before you can get printing.
Right.
So I'd say look around, but I'd also suggest just avoid anything under $150 at the moment. A lot of cheap clones with poor firmware and poor bed leveling kind of flood that market, and so you don't know what you're ending up with down at that price point.
There you go. CRS 98 says we have a lot of Bamboo printers as their standard 3D printers at work.
Yeah, when it comes to it, kind of the two prosumer models anymore are Prusa and Bamboo, and they're both constantly playing off of each other. Somebody will add a feature, and then the next version of the other one will have that same feature and maybe improve it slightly. Things like that.
Skyhawker asks, can you give us a link to a good site for printer recommendations and tutorials?
That's an excellent question.
Isn't it though?
Yeah.
I was thinking Thingiverse, but maybe not.
I would not. I don't trust Thingiverse anymore. That's why Printables exists, because Thingiverse really went downhill for a while. I'd say that a lot of 3D printer YouTubers, I mentioned CNC Kitchen earlier, they often have, I'm thinking Maker's Muse, Angus over at Maker's Muse, they do a lot of, they often get sent printers, so they'll do a lot of reviews, so you can check their stuff out. Printable, Prusa 3D, the website, has a lot of great things about like modeling for 3D printing and getting set up for 3D printing. Yeah, it's all mostly focused on their own printers, but a lot of the stuff they talk about can be used with other printers and other vendors. Yeah, it won't be exactly one-to-one, but it gets you a good idea to get started. They've got a lot of stuff going on in their info base there for kind of like, how do I design for 3D printing? Because you have to take into consideration things like overhangs and like you don't necessarily want to print a hollow box, because the roof, you've got to drag that filament the entire way and it's going to droop.
Yeah.
Even the best, most well-tuned printer can't do a really, really long bridge. Right. Some will do some actually amazingly long bridges, but you don't want to have to trust that.
Right.
That it will do that.
So a quick internet search found places like PC Mag, CNET, Tom's Hardware.
Tom's Hardware generally is, yeah.
Yeah.
Your standard computer review places are generally also going to be, are generally going to be okay for 3D printer reviews. Especially because your PC review places are also usually aimed at the people who are building their own PC, and it's kind of it's kind of the same. There's a lot of overlap in that community of, I just want to use my hands and make things. I want to have an idea and have something come out at the end.
Right. Now, speaking of using your hands, once you 3D print something, how do you finish it? Do you sand it? Do you what are some of the I don't want to use the wrong term, but there are some finishing techniques where you kind of just melt and smooth
So
the edge.
that really depends on what your final goal is and what your model is like. So easily the easiest process is taking sandpaper or maybe a fine file to get into some of the corners, and that will allow you to knock down the ridge lines of your layer lines. The other thing you can do is you can just print with thinner layers, and then you have much smaller layer lines. If you're printing with something like ABS, you can use vapor smoothing.
Yep.
Where vapor smoothing scares me because it involves basically boiling acetone and creating acetone vapor that then envelops your ABS print, because ABS, which is also what styrofoam cups are made out of, is soluble in acetone. So it ends up just slightly basically melting the outside edge and smoothing it over that way, which can create some really, really nice finishes, but you're heating up a very flammable substance. Yeah, I can see why this would be a little bit sketchy. Well, a very flammable substance that you need to keep enclosed so that it actually keeps around your thing. Yeah, it's literally creating a bomb if you're not careful. So you can do vapor smoothing. Some of your other filaments, PLA and PETG, both have solvents that they dissolve in, but they're not fun things like methyl ethyl ketone and dichloromethane, and you're just like, I don't want these around my house if I can avoid it. Type things. So usually if you need like a really good finish, sanding, or the other thing you can do is another one I've seen is you take you create a cornstarch and a slurry with some water, and then you mix a very small amount of CA glue into it, and then you paint that on, and then you paint over it, and that'll just fill in the ridge lines, and then basically it's acting like Bondo would on a car at that point.
Interesting. Okay. Well, good stuff. This is a lot of fun. I mean, now I hope you guys are encouraged and excited to go do your own 3D models. If you just, want to look and find some models and have someone else print it, go for it. You never know what's going to happen. So Bpendragon, thank you so much, or Bpen, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
And folks, thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Caching in the Northwest. Now, if our listeners wanted to get in contact with you, what's the best way to do that?
I guess for geocaching related things, probably Messenger, geocaching Messenger, whatever the messaging service is called these days. I'm Bpendragon on geocaching. I'm Bpendragon on Discord. I'm Bpendragon basically everywhere except Twitter and Instagram, where I ended up with the Bpendragon. But if you find a Bpendragon on a service, it's probably me. So you can
without a definitive article.
With or without a definitive article, yeah. But for geocaching related things, probably just geocaching Messenger, Bpendragon.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, as we wrap up, we want to take a moment to thank Land Sharks and Gold Country Geotourism, our corporate Denali level sponsors. Landsharks.ca is the outdoor adventure and geocaching store. Check them out online. Remember, they're shipping those online orders daily, and for absolutely amazing geocaching adventures, check out exploregoldcountry.com. And we want to thank all of our faithful Denali level supporters, Land Sharks, Gold Country Geotourism, but also Groovy Owl, Cool Cow Cachers, who I saw their name in a log very recently. That was fun.
Well, and they're on
And
tonight.
sorry?
They're in the chat tonight.
Well, hello. And of course, Cachly, the geocaching app. Folks, if you want to know more about supporting this here podcast, well, we encourage you to click that Patreon link on the cachingnw.com website.
Like Greenwords did.
And Korsgat.
And Flagman.
And I hope I'm pronouncing this right. Camp Clan? Yeah,
Oh, man, you got to watch out for those guys.
They tend to dominate the chat.
Yeah, they're chatty folks. As is GSM times 2 often.
And Dora Moore.
And Kid Vegas 19.
And Teus.
Terrible lunch, great geocacher, gas station tuna.
The contributor of the glow this evening, Limax.
Active in the chat, CRS 98.
Skyhawker.
Trexer.
Nervous Energies.
That guy right there, Bpendragon.
What? Where? Gotta watch out for
the
him.
other side.
I've seen him. GeoNav Pro.
The Subway Mark.
Ackerdock.
Wino Seattle.
Kev MacD.
You talks to rocks.
You, Dak.
Mountain Bike.
Nerve.
Seebeck Tribe.
Just finding our way.
Sege Hove.
Boomer 365.
Butterfly Girl.
MC3 Cats.
Alarobrick.
Logwork.
GeoBirder.
Geo. BC Rock Crawler.
Wet Coaster.
J-Car.
Ari 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Geocaches.
Kitty Quest.
Genies.
The LG 9000.
Saw him in the chat earlier. Just Carlo.
Whidbey Island Gal.
Railroad.
Peach of, and she confirmed it tonight, Washington.
That's right.
Peach of somewhere. And of course, Team Noltex.
Awesome.
So, folks, thanks for taking the time to listen to this episode of Caching in the Northwest. Your support helps keep the quality shows coming. If you like the show, please click the Patreon link on the cachingnw.com website. And if you didn't like the show, you still click on that link because we want to know what you want us to talk about, and you'll never hear it if you're not subscribed. So there you go. And as I like to say, if you like the vibe, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and give us a review, because if you were in a restaurant, you would tip. If you were in a live audience, you would clap. But since you're on a podcast, leave us a free, fast, fabulous, fantastic 5-star review. And of course, you can call into 253-693-TFTC and leave us a comment, ask us a question, or print a hydrocoptic marsal vein fitted to the ambifacient lunar wane shaft any time of the day or night. And of course, you can email us feedback@cachingnw.com. And okay, I'll say I've only heard those words. I've never seen those words printed.
I was going to say, I would be really curious whether you put that into the show notes and then couldn't read it.
No, I know who put that into the show notes now.
I think it was Breiling.
I'm not going with that one. No.
Okay.
No. Got to blame somebody else here on the hosts. And of course, did I say you can email us at feedback@cachingnw.com?
You did now.
Yeah. If you want to include a lunar wane shaft, that would help.
Yeah.
And you can join us every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Pacific for a live show and chat. This show is produced by Chris Umfenauer, Jim Paulwitz, Jay Kennedy, and Brian Lang. It's licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 license, copyright 2024 by Chris Umfenauer. And folks, I ask you to stay tuned for
The After Show. The Bunko Squad.
You are the Bunko Squad. Let's see.
We got one from Kitty Quest. Yeah. Kitty Quest. Congratulations on logging your 1100th Yesterday.
1100th.
Wow.
That's a lot of finds.
11,000 geocaches. She logged them all yesterday.
Well, unless that's binary, in which case it's just 24.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
That's awesome. Congrats.
Yeah, congrats. That's great.
That's
quite a
a
milestone.
lot of caches.
Yeah.
That is a big pile of caches. Let's see. Seebeck Tribe said, I sent in a glow about my experience that happened to me in Lewiston, Idaho earlier this month. And that we might have to make into a show. That could be worth it.
Okay. Looking forward to that one.
So, or at least we'll have to have her on the show for a segment to talk about it.
Color me intrigued.
Ooh.
All right.
Color her pickup yellow.
Not sure if there's anything else for Fatas tonight.
That's all I see for Fatas.
that's all
Now,
I
we are
noticed.
without our regular Fatas lackey,
Yeah.
maybe a chat lackey, but I think we caught everything that came through. So, folks,
Looks like it.
thank you so much for joining us. And until next week, go out and find a 3D printed cache in the Northwest.